Imagine waking up and your electricity is gone, not for an hour, not for a day, gone indefinitely. No lights, no air conditioning in the middle of summer. Hospitals running on backup generators that are hours from running out of fuel. Water pumps not working. Food spoiling in refrigerators across an entire region. Factories shut down. And the government telling you there is no quick fix, because the facility that supplied electricity to millions of people was just targeted by an Iranian missile. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is the situation Israel is now managing in real time. And the strike on the Orot Rabin power station near Hadera is not the headline, it is the signal that this war has crossed a line that changes the calculations of every government watching it unfold, and that the consequences of what is now happening extend far beyond the borders of any one country. On March 25, 2026, Iranian ballistic missiles targeted the Orot Rabin power station in Hadera, Israel's largest electricity generation facility. The plant sits on Israel's Mediterranean coast, approximately 45 kilometers north of Tel Aviv. It produces 2,590 megawatts of electricity, approximately 20% of the entire country's power output running through one location. And in the hours before those missiles arrived, Iranian state media published images of IRGC Aerospace Force missiles bearing a photograph of the Orot Rabin facility. The English-language message printed on those missiles read, "We are ready, Orot Rabin." That is not propaganda, that is a targeting declaration printed on a weapon before it is fired. The intent was not ambiguous, it was announced. On the same day, in the same operational wave, Iranian missiles also targeted the Bazan Group oil refineries in Haifa Bay, Israel's primary refining complex, for the second time in this conflict. Separate strikes hit Israeli military command infrastructure. The IRGC announced Wave 80 of Operation True Promise 4, a campaign that has not paused for a single day since February 28, 2026, averaging more than 3 separate salvos every day for 26 consecutive days. Subscribe right now and turn on all notifications. What is happening here is not a story about one power plant. It is a story about the moment a war shifts from targeting military capacity to targeting the daily survival infrastructure of civilian populations, and about what that shift means for the trajectory of a conflict that the official American narrative has been describing as nearly over for the better part of 2 weeks. To understand why the Orot Rabin strike matters in ways that far exceed the immediate physical damage, you need to understand what Iran is actually trying to accomplish in this war. Because Iran cannot fight the United States and Israel in a traditional military confrontation and achieve military victory in any conventional sense, everyone understands this. The United States has the most powerful military in human history. Israel has some of the most sophisticated air defense and precision strike capabilities ever deployed in a regional theater. Iran cannot match that with aircraft carriers, fifth-generation fighters, or satellite-guided weapons at the same scale and density. So Iran is not fighting that war. Iran is fighting a completely different kind of war. A war designed not to achieve military victory in the traditional sense, but to make the cost of fighting so high, so economically damaging, and so psychologically unbearable for the other side, that the calculation reverses, that the price of continuing becomes more painful than the price of stopping. Military experts describe this as asymmetric warfare. You fight with the tools that match your actual capabilities rather than trying to mirror a stronger opponent on ground they dominate. For Iran, those tools are missiles, drones, proxy forces operating on multiple simultaneous fronts, economic disruption through the Strait of Hormuz, and now systematic attacks on civilian infrastructure. Each tool is designed to impose a different category of cost, and the Orot Rabin strike is a demonstration of that strategy in its most direct and visible form. When you destroy a military base, you hurt the military. When you destroy a power station that supplies 20% of a country's electricity, you hurt everyone. Every family that loses power, every hospital that switches to emergency generators counting the hours of fuel remaining, every business that cannot operate, every factory that goes dark, Every person who cannot pump water into their home in the middle of a conflict that shows no sign of ending. The psychological and economic weight of a power grid collapsing is not a military setback. It is a social rupture. It makes ordinary people ask their government a question that military commanders cannot answer with a press briefing. It makes them ask whether this war is worth continuing. And that is precisely what Iran's strategy is designed to generate. Not military victory, political will to stop. The pressure that eventually reaches decision-makers not through battlefield losses, but through the accumulated anger and exhaustion of millions of civilians experiencing a conflict in their daily lives, rather than only through casualty reports. Now let us be analytically precise about the Iran's Energy Minister Abbas Ali Abadi's public statement that landed in this context, because he made it before the missiles were fired, and it reads differently after them. He said publicly that Iran generates its power across more than 150 decentralized plants nationwide. Then he added that Israel and the Gulf states concentrate their production in a small number of facilities that are, in his words, centralized and very vulnerable. And the IRGC reinforced that message with a doctrinal statement of 4 words: "If you hit electricity, we hit electricity." That is not a warning. That is the operational logic of a mirror strategy being announced in advance, so that when the missiles land, nobody can claim surprise. The electricity dimension connects directly to why this strike changes the military picture in ways that go beyond the humanitarian consequences. Israel's military depends on electricity. Radar systems that track incoming missiles depend on electricity. Communication networks coordinating defensive responses depend on electricity. Air defense control centers that sequence intercept decisions depend on electricity. Emergency services responding to missile strikes depend on electricity. Losing 20% of national generating capacity, while managing active missile strikes across 3 simultaneous fronts, is not an inconvenience. The Israeli Defense Forces can treat as background noise. It is a strategic problem that compounds every other pressure the country is managing simultaneously. Stay with this analysis, because there is a dimension of this story that has been reported and then immediately passed over without the weight it deserves. 2 days before the Orot Rabin strike, Iran published through its semi-official fast news agency a complete list of power stations and energy infrastructure across Israel and the Gulf states, citing the military as the source. The statement attached to that list read, "All power plants, energy infrastructure, and information and communications technology infrastructure are now targets if the United States follows through on threats to bomb Iranian power stations," and crucially, that warning specifically included Gulf Arab states. Iran did not draw a distinction between Israeli civilian energy infrastructure and Gulf civilian energy infrastructure. The warning was regional, the target list was regional. That is not an abstract threat. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, commingle their power stations with their desalination facilities. In countries where annual rainfall is structurally insufficient to support the population densities of major urban areas, desalination plants are not backup systems. They are the mechanism by which millions of people access drinking water. Threatening power stations in the Gulf is simultaneously threatening the water supply of tens of millions of people. And Bloomberg had already confirmed before these strikes that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were privately discussing whether to enter this war directly if their critical civilian infrastructure gets hit. The Orot Rabin strike is not just a strike on Israel. It is a message to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi about what comes next if they move in that direction. Now let us examine where the diplomatic architecture of this conflict stands, because what is happening at the negotiating table, or rather at the collection of intermediary channels that have replaced a negotiating table, is the essential context for understanding why the Orot Rabin strike landed when it did. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar confirmed publicly this week that his country is facilitating indirect talks between the United States and Iran by relaying messages between the two sides. Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed the United States had presented a 15-point action framework to Iran through Pakistan as the intermediary. That framework reportedly covers sanctions relief, a rollback of Iran's nuclear program, limits on its missile development, reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and curbs on Iran's support for proxy forces across the region. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif formally offered Islamabad as a venue for direct talks, if both sides agreed. Egypt and Turkey have been serving as additional message carriers. The framework for a potential diplomatic off-ramp was described by mediators as a comprehensive deal and was being treated as the basis for further discussion. Iran's response requires reading precisely because it communicates something specific about where Tehran assesses the current balance of pressure to be. Iran publicly rejected the 15-point proposal, describing it as maximalist and unreasonable. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed Iran had received the proposal, but said the country was not negotiating with the United States, that the back-channel exchanges did not constitute negotiations, and that Iran would end the war when it decided to do so, and when its own conditions were met. Iran's counter-proposal contained 5 conditions of its own: a halt to the killing of Iranian officials, concrete guarantees preventing any future war, reparations for the conflict, a comprehensive end to hostilities across all fronts including all proxy forces, and the recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian military spokesman dismissed Washington's diplomatic push and delivered a direct message: do not call your defeat an agreement. You will see neither your investments in the region nor the former prices of energy and oil again until you understand this. Stability in the region is guaranteed by the strong hand of our armed forces. That is the diplomatic picture as the missiles targeted Orot Rabin. Indirect talks in progress through 3 separate intermediary countries. Iran publicly denying any negotiations are occurring, while simultaneously receiving proposals. A 15-point American framework on the table. Iran's counterproposal on the table. Pakistan offering its capital as a venue for in-person talks. As early as the same week the power station was struck, and against that backdrop of fragile, contested, publicly denied diplomacy, Iranian missiles carrying published targeting photographs arrived at the vicinity of Israel's largest electricity facility. The political problem this creates for every party involved is worth examining directly, because the decisions made in the next 48 to 72 hours in response to what happened will determine whether the next chapter of this conflict moves toward a managed diplomatic off-ramp or toward the kind of escalation that makes every previous development look restrained by comparison. For the Trump administration, the Orot Rabin strike creates a specific political trap. Trump had been publicly signaling that a ceasefire was close, that Iran had made significant concessions, that the situation was under control, that American planes were flying over Tehran, and Iran could not do a thing about it. He had issued a deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and then announced a 10-day pause on that deadline, citing productive conversations, telling the world that negotiations were progressing. And then Iranian missiles targeted the largest power station in America's closest military ally in the region. That sequence is not a communications problem that better messaging can manage. It is a credibility gap that widens every time the operational reality contradicts the official framing. Trump has now told Iran that striking Israeli civilian infrastructure is something Iran can do while the United States is pausing its own escalatory threats and describing the diplomatic situation as progressing. The signal that sends, intentional or not, is the signal Iran's strategists were trying to extract. For Israel, the political pressure is different, but equally acute. An Iranian missile struck Israeli civilian power infrastructure, and a photograph of that facility was printed on the weapon before it was fired. The Israeli population sitting in the dark in Tel Aviv's suburbs, the hospitals activating emergency generators, the businesses that cannot operate, are not asking their government about the strategic logic of restraint. They are asking why Iran was able to do this and what the government intends to do about it. The Israeli Defense Ministry announced this week that 400,000 reservists had been authorized for call-up. Defense Minister Israel Katz confirmed that he and IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir had approved a new series of targets for strikes in both Iran and Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was reported to have ordered the military to launch as many strikes against Iran as possible in a 48-hour window, based on concerns that Trump might declare an end to the war before Israeli objectives were achieved. That is, the Israeli government responding to diplomatic pressure by accelerating military operations, not slowing them, and the combination of those two contradictory impulses, American diplomatic deceleration and Israeli military acceleration, is the structural tension at the center of the alliance conducting this war. Subscribe and share this breakdown with anyone who is trying to understand why this conflict is so difficult to end. What follows is the economic dimension that connects what is happening in Israel to household budgets in countries that have no direct stake in this conflict. The Orot Rabin strike adds a new layer of fear to energy markets that were already operating under the most severe supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, as the International Energy Agency itself has described it. Before the war began on February 28, Brent crude traded at approximately $65 per barrel. By the time Iran targeted Israel's largest power station, it had been moving between $100 and $110, having spiked near $120 in the first 2 weeks of the conflict. The IEA had already released 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest such release in its history. The United States had committed 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Prices barely moved. The market was communicating something specific when the largest emergency reserve release in history produced only a temporary correction, that the disruption is structural, not temporary, and that reserves address inventory levels, not the fear premium that comes from a conflict with no visible endpoint, targeting the geography through which 20% of globally traded oil must pass. Now add the power station dimension to that picture. When investors and analysts process the Orot Rabin strike, the question being priced is not whether Israel's electricity grid will survive. It is what Iran's demonstrated willingness to target $4.2 billion civilian energy facilities means for the next target. If a power plant is a legitimate wartime target, is a water treatment facility the next logical step? Is a communications grid? Is the financial infrastructure that keeps banks and businesses functioning? Once a precedent is established that civilian energy systems are within the scope of the conflict, there is no clear logical stopping point, and markets do not price specific probabilities, they price uncertainty. Uncertainty drives volatility. Volatility drives risk premiums, and risk premiums translate into higher costs for everything that depends on energy and stable financial systems, which is every sector of every economy on Earth. The fertilizer supply chain consequence of this conflict is the dimension that most coverage continues to treat as a footnote, and it is not a footnote. Qatar is one of the world's largest producers of nitrogen-based fertilizers, the compounds that underpin global production of corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans. Qatar Energy has curtailed output following strikes on its facilities. Analysts assess that approximately 30% of global ammonia production is now at risk from the disruptions concentrated in this conflict's geography. Brazil supplies nearly 60% of global soybean exports and depends on fertilizer shipments that transit the Strait of Hormuz. Spring planting decisions in the American Midwest, in Brazilian agricultural regions, in Southeast Asian rice production areas, are being made right now against a backdrop of elevated fertilizer costs and disrupted supply chains. The harvest that reaches grocery stores by late summer and into 2027 is being determined by decisions that farmers and distributors are making today, not by what happens on the battlefield in the weeks ahead. The line from an Iranian missile targeting a power station in Hadera to the price of a loaf of bread in Lagos, in Chicago, in Jakarta, is documentable. It runs through fertilizer supply chains and the Strait of Hormuz and the agricultural decisions being made this week. Here is the complete picture, that the evidence of 26 days, 80 waves, and now a deliberate strike on civilian energy infrastructure has assembled. Iran has sustained more than 3 attack waves per day without exhausting its operational tempo, despite official American characterizations of 86% degradation. It has incorporated cluster warheads into a significant share of its ballistic missile inventory, specifically to break the intercept mathematics of the most expensive air defense architecture ever deployed. It has targeted Israel's Northern Command headquarters at Dado Base, the facility through which every troop rotation, every artillery order, and every armored deployment in the Lebanese theater runs. It has struck the Orot Rabin power station, the single facility providing 20% of Israeli national electricity, with its targeting intent announced on the missiles before they were fired. It has threatened the desalination and power infrastructure of Gulf Arab states in terms specific enough to prompt Bloomberg to report private Saudi and Emirati deliberations about direct military intervention. It has publicly rejected a 15-point American ceasefire framework as maximalist and unreasonable, while simultaneously issuing a 5-point counter-proposal containing conditions that every professional analyst examining them describes as structurally impossible for Washington to accept. And it has done all of this while the Trump administration was publicly describing productive conversations and diplomatic progress. The question that matters now is not whether Iran has been degraded. That question has been answered by 26 days of operational evidence that cannot be reconciled with the characterization of a militarily dead adversary. The question is what happens when a country conducting a grinding infrastructure campaign against civilian energy systems, military command headquarters and regional economic architecture does so from a negotiating position in which it has rejected the framework being offered and believes the current operational trajectory is more favorable to its interests than accepting a deal. Governments do not reject ceasefire proposals when they believe the military situation is deteriorating against them. Iran's flat public rejection of the 15-point framework, issued simultaneously with strikes on Israeli civilian infrastructure, reflects an Iranian assessment that continued operations are producing leverage rather than exhausting it. The escalation trap that this creates for Washington and Jerusalem is the same one that military theorists have documented with sufficient historical evidence that its mechanics are not in dispute. When a decisive military action does not produce the expected capitulation, the operational logic demands a larger action. The larger action produces adaptation from the adversary rather than surrender. Each successive step requires more force than the previous one to produce the same effect. The force commitment escalates. The political cost of acknowledging the limits of available options rises, and the original objective, in this case regime change and the permanent elimination of Iran's nuclear and military capacity, becomes obscured by the accumulating logic of each escalation justifying the next one. Pakistan is still trying, Egypt is still carrying messages, Turkey is still positioning itself as a conduit. A Pakistani official confirmed to Reuters that Israel had removed Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf from its targeting list after Pakistan argued there would be no one left to negotiate with if they were eliminated. That single detail, the removal of Iranian diplomatic officials from an active kill list at the request of a mediating country, is the clearest signal available that somewhere behind the public declarations and the targeting photographs on missiles, back-channel communication is occurring at a level that neither side is prepared to acknowledge openly. But back-channel communication occurring in the background while missiles strike power stations in the foreground is not a pathway to a ceasefire. It is a race between the diplomatic track and the escalatory track to see which one reaches a decisive outcome first. The Orot Rabin strike, the targeting photographs, the doctrinal statement about mirroring attacks on electricity, the public rejection of the American framework, and the continued operational tempo of Wave 80 are all telling the same story from different angles. Iran believes it is operating from a position of sufficient strength that accepting the terms currently on offer is not in its interest. And until that assessment changes, either through a shift in the military balance, a shift in the economic pressure it can absorb, or a shift in the terms being offered, the next power station, the next command headquarters, the next wave are not hypotheticals. They are scheduled. Turn on all notifications. When Israel's response to the Orot Rabin strike clarifies whether the power plant precedent is being matched or restrained, the analysis will be here. When the Pakistan mediation track produces either a confirmed meeting or a confirmed collapse, the analysis will be here. When the energy market prices in the full economic consequence of civilian infrastructure becoming a systematic target in a conflict with no declared endpoint, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. Leave one answer in the comments before you go. Iran's energy minister stated publicly that Israel concentrates its production in a small number of facilities that are centralized and very vulnerable. If the precedent of targeting civilian power infrastructure is now established on both sides of this conflict, what does the next escalatory step look like? And is there a diplomatic framework that reaches a deal before it gets there? Every response gets read,